Welcome to Grow Groups at Port City. I'm so glad you decided to come back and that your crazy Grow Group didn't scare you away. We started this series this past Sunday in the book of Colossians with the series theme being Christ alone. The people to whom the book was written lived in a very diverse city with a lot of conflicting points of view and conflicting beliefs. And the church began to wonder, the church began to get distracted and lose their focus on the most important thing. And that most important thing for us as followers of Jesus is Christ and Christ alone. So Paul begins to write to the church and he begins to give them some instructions on how to maintain their focus on Christ alone. As servants of Christ, as individuals, as family members, in every area of life, how to keep Christ at the center and it to be Christ alone. So Paul begins to write. He begins with an introduction talking about who he was, a servant, and that it was by the will of God. And we talked a few minutes about identity and how it's important to know what your identity is and in whom you find your identity. Because we all find our identity outside of ourselves. We also took a few moments to look back at the life of Paul. And if Paul was called by God to be an apostle, then what did God use or what in his life gave clues to God's will in his life? Oftentimes we find clues about God's will for our life. First of all, by putting him at the center of all things. And then secondly, by answering the question that God asked Moses. God asked Moses, "What's in your hand, Moses?" And Moses says, "A staff." So God says, "Moses, since there is a staff in your hands, we're going to use a staff. So throw that thing down and watch me do miracles with what you have in your hand." Moses throws the staff down. It turns into a serpent. And it reveals the power of God, and it reveals that God was working in and through Moses. Then he tells Moses, pick it up. Pick up that serpent. And so Moses picks it up and it turns back into a staff. So we look at the Apostle Paul as he's writing this letter. It shouldn't surprise us that God calls Paul to be a teacher of the gospel because Paul was trained to be a teacher. God basically asked Paul, "What's in your hand?" And Paul says, "Well, I have teaching skills. I have speaking skills. I have international skills. I'm a Roman citizen, but I have Jewish heritage." And he had all of these things in his hands. And so God took the things that were in his hand, coupled with his identity in Christ alone, and used him to be a great, if not the greatest apostle in the New Testament. So as we start out this series talking about in Christ alone, what we want to drive home and what we want you to talk about in your Grow Group tonight is how is Christ at the center of your life? And then secondly, what has God placed already in your hands that he can use for his honor and his glory? Discovering God's will is not really that complicated. It's making Christ the center of everything. Living your life with Christ alone at the center, and then being willing to use whatever is in your hands for the glory of God. And if you will do that, you will find your identity, you will find your purpose, and you will find fulfillment as you go down this journey called life. I hope that you'll continue to join us as we go through this series in Christ alone, and that you and I will grow in our faith and grow closer to him. God bless you and have a great Grow Group. We'll see you soon.